Welcome to Azure Teach.net. In this demo, we are going to develop a Web API controller that can be accessed only if the user is authenticated with Azure AD and also the user has this particular AD group. We are going to validate the authorization using Azure Graph API and also discuss the corner scenarios like groups, overage. Stay tuned. Before we start, please subscribe to Azure Teach.net channel for more videos on Azure and .NET. We already have Azure AD Authentication and role-based authorization. Why do we need Azure AD Groups based authorization? Let us understand that with few scenarios. If you see here we have four different applications inside an organization and all of these are protected by Azure AD Authentication. So if the Azure AD login is successful, this user should be able to access all of these applications. But in real world, there exists boundaries between the teams. If this user belongs to app1 a related team and this user should not be allowed to access the remaining applications. So in these kind of situations, we can use role-based authorization and assume this user should be allowed to access app1 and app2. So in that case, we have to assign roles related to app1 and also app2 to this user. We can simplify this process using Azure AD Groups. We can provide authorization to an Azure AD group and we can assign that to the user. Please note that if we have any application specific rules, we still have to use them. But here I'm talking about the basic part of accessing the application that I am going to show you in the next diagram. Here, if you see a new developer joined the team, he must have to access Jira, Dev Database, Git, and also Dev Web App. And if the application using any file share, he must be able to access the file share as well. So we can provide access by using different roles related to these applications, but the best practice is to use a team specific Azure AD group and provide authorization to that group and assign that to the user. So we can create a team specific Azure AD group and authorize that. Assume this user belongs to a team which owns app1 and app2. We can assign the access to that Azure AD group to access these two applications. If the Azure AD login is successful, this user can be able to access app1 and app2 but not app3 and app4. Let us implement this in a .NET 6 Web API application. But of course, the code that I'm going to write would work in other versions of .NET as well. Here I'm creating a .NET 6 Web API project. And here I'm choosing .NET 6.4 and clicking on Create. The project is created. Now here I'm going to Connected Services. And after that, here I'm choosing Add a Service Dependency. And scrolling down, and here I'm choosing Microsoft Identity Platform, clicking on Next. And here it has to identify the type of project, so it has to run this tool. So I'm clicking on Finish now. Now again we have to click on Add a Service Dependency, and after that choose Microsoft Identity Platform, click on Next. Here it is showing all the app registrations which are owned by me. And here we have to create an app registration for our application. Number of app registrations is equal to number of apps which uses Azure AD Authentication. So here I'm creating an app registration with this name, clicking on register. It created an app registration, clicking on next. And here we have to use Microsoft Graph API, so I'm choosing this. Why we need to use that? We are going to see that in the demo. I'm clicking on next over here. And here it is showing that it has created a client secret inside the app registration. So here I'm clicking on next, and now it has to add code, add NuGet packages, and also the secret store to store the client secret, and it will update the app settings.json and also update the Azure AD. So here I'm clicking on finish. This is completed. It has added Azure AD related NuGet packages, and inside app settings.json it added Azure AD configuration and also Microsoft Graph related configuration, and added the basic permission of Microsoft Graph. And here if you see, here it added access as user as a scope for this web API application, but of course we can give any name. I'll show you this inside the Azure portal as well. And after that, inside this program.cs it added this particular code which is related to Azure AD configuration and also these two lines. Let us understand this code. So here it added the JWT bearer defaults related authentication scheme because Azure uses that, and here it added Microsoft Identity Web API as this is a web API application, and here it is reading Azure AD related configuration, and here it added enable token acquisition to call downstream API. In our application we are calling Graph API, so that is the downstream, and here it added Microsoft Graph with the configuration that it has added over here. And after that, here it added in-memory token cache, because if this application have to call any downstream API, it has to preserve the token somewhere. So here we are saying that the tokens can be preserved inside memory. Here I'm in Azure portal. I'm going to Azure Active Directory, app registrations, and here we have the app registration that was created by Visual Studio, and here we have the client ID and tenant ID, and the same were configured inside our app settings.json. And here if you see, we have access as user as scope, and here I'm going to expose an API, and here if you see, we have the application ID URI and also the scope which was appended with the application ID URI. So if any client application want to access our API, the client must use this particular scope in generating the token, then only it can be allowed to access our API. You can define multiple scopes. So assume you have 10 controllers, you can define 10 scopes and limit access to each individual controller. If you go to the default weather forecast controller, here it added the scope. So if any client application want to access weather forecast controller of this API, the client must use this particular scope, that is access as user in generating the access token, then only it will be allowed to access weather forecast controller. Now I want to add a new controller because it has lot of code and some people may get confused, so that's the reason I'm adding a new controller. Here I'm adding a controller API controller empty, clicking on add, and here I want to give the name as names controller, and here I'm writing public iAction result get names. Here I am not writing any fancy code related to entity framework because our primary focus is Azure AD Groups based authorization. So here I am hard coding the response, so return OK, new list of string, and inside this I want to return two names, and here I want to write HTTP GET. I want to go with the action name for the route, so here I am writing action, and after that here I want to authorize this, so I'm writing authorize, press Ctrl dot, and we have to use this namespace. And I want to define the scope as well. I want to reuse the scope that is already over here, so I'm copying this and I'm pasting on top of this. Now we have to add the required namespaces. So I'm pressing Ctrl dot, add this. Now I'm running this solution. I want to see if the basic Azure AD part is working fine or not. I want to test this application with Postman. Now here I am in Postman and I'm pasting the URL. I'm clicking on send button. So here we got 401 unauthorized. As the Postman is the client app which access the API, we have to create an app registration for the Postman as well. So here I'm going to app registration, and here I'm clicking on new app registration, and I am naming it as Postman app, and I'm clicking on register. Now I'm going to authentication and clicking on add platform. I want to use implicit authentication flow, so here I'm choosing single page application, but you can use any type of application. Here I'm using the redirect URI as this one, because once we get the token, Postman will listen to this particular URL and grab the token. And after that, here I am enabling these two checkboxes. I'm clicking on configure, and after that here I'm going to API permissions, and here I'm clicking on add permission, my APIs, and here we have our app registration or the API, and we have the delegated permissions because we are using access as user. I'm choosing this, clicking on add permissions. Here I'm in Postman, I'm going to authorization tab, and here I'm choosing OAuth 2.4, and here we have to choose request headers, and after that here the grant type should be implicit, and here if you see the callback URL is this one, and if you see over here inside the authentication part of the Postman app registration, we have configured the same over here, and here I want to authorize using the browser, and after that here we need to provide the auth URL that you can get by going to overview section, endpoints, and here you can copy this and go to the Postman and paste it over here. Here we want to mention the client ID. So here I'm going to app registration, and here we have the client ID. So I'm copying this. I'm going to Postman again and pasting it over here. And here we have to mention the scope. And our scope is, we can go to API permissions, and here we have the scope. Click on this and copy this, go to the Postman over here and paste it over here, and after that clicking on get new access token. So here if you see, I have already logged in with a user called Robert, so that is the reason it is directly asking for consent. Otherwise it would have shown us the login screen, and here it is asking for the permissions that the user can consent. I'm clicking on accept, and here it is asking us to open Postman. I'm clicking on open Postman and clicking on proceed over here. I want to use the generated token, clicking on use token. Now I'm clicking on send button. Earlier we got 401 unauthorized. Now I'm clicking on send button, and now we got the response. That means our Azure AD setup is working fine. Here I am going to Azure Active Directory, Groups, clicking on New Group, and I'm choosing group type as security. I'm giving the name as G underscore AG AD Group Auth Demo, and I'm giving the group description as Azure AD Group Authorization Demo, and clicking on create. The group have been created. Now I want to assign this group to Robert, so I'm clicking on here, and after that here I'm choosing members and add members, and here I'm searching for Robert, choosing this particular user, clicking on select. Group have been assigned to this user. Now I am in our API apps app registration, going to token configuration, clicking on add groups claim, choosing security groups because we have created the security group, and after that here I want to go with the default selection for these two token properties by type, and I'm clicking on add. Now I'm going to Postman, clicking on generate new access token. I'm choosing the user account, clicking on open, and now clicking on proceed, and here I'm copying this token, going to jwt.io site, and here I'm pasting the token, and here if you see now we have the groups inside the token, so we can do the validation against this and we can authorize the user. But this is not the end of the story. This approach has a drawback that I'll show you later. To authorize using Azure AD Groups, we have to define the policies. Here I am adding a new class and I am naming this as Group Authorization Requirement. Clicking on Add, and we have to implement this class from authorization requirement. Press Ctrl dot and add this namespace. This is just a marker interface, that means it don't have any properties or methods, but still we have to implement this. And after that here I'm writing a property public string group ID. This is getter only because we are going to set this from constructor. I'm pressing Ctrl dot over here, generate constructor, and here I'm writing string group ID, and here I'm setting group ID is equal to group ID. Please don't get confused with this code. I am going to explain each line of this later. Now we have to define a handler, so here I'm clicking on add class and I'm naming this as group authorization handler, and we have to implement this from authorization handler. Press Ctrl dot and use this namespace, and to this we have to pass the template parameter, that is group authorization requirement, and after that here press Ctrl dot because we have to implement the abstract class. Inside this method we have to see if the user has the required groups or not. I'm going to explain this code after writing the entire code, but for now let me write something like this. So here we can write something like context.user.claims.any x.type is equal to groups, because in the JWT token we have seen that the group claims comes with the type as groups. I have shown you this inside the jwt.io site just before, and then x dot value is equal to requirement dot group id. So if this condition matches, then here we are setting context dot succeed, and to this we are passing the requirement, and after that here we are returning task dot completed task. Now I am going to program.cs. If you are using lower versions of .NET framework, then you have to go to startup.cs class, and here I am writing builder.services.add authorization, and to this we are writing a lambda option, and inside this I'm writing options dot add policy, and here we have to mention a policy name. So this is something like Azure teach policy, and after that here we have to define the policy. So here I'm writing policy policy dot requirement dot add, and to this we need to pass new group authorization requirement. This class we have written just before, and to this we have to pass the group ID. So here I am going to app settings.json, and here I am writing Azure Teach Group, and here inside this I am defining a property group ID, and here we have to paste the group ID. I'm copying this, I'm going over here, and here I'm writing builder.configuration, and here we have to pass the path. So here I'm writing Azure Teach Group, and after that group ID. And now here I'm going over here, and here we have the group. I'm copying the group ID, and after that here inside app settings.json I'm pasting it over here. Now we want to define this policy on our controller. So here I'm going to names controller, and after that here I'm giving the policy name. So here policy is equal to, and going to program.cs class, copying this name and going over here and pasting it over here. We have to register our group authorization handler inside program.cs. So here I'm writing builder.services.add singleton, and here we have to write I authorization handler, press Ctrl dot add required namespace, and here we have to write group authorization handler. On a controller, we can use only one policy, but if we take roles, we can use multiple. So if you want to validate against multiple AD groups, you can define a comma separated group IDs over here, and you can pass them from the program.cs and here inside this class and accept those list of IDs in its constructor and preserve it. And in group authorization handler, you can modify this logic to perform the validation on the groups. Now I am running this application. Now here I am in the user Robert, and here I am removing this group for our testing. Now this user does not have the required group. Here I am generating the new access token, and I am choosing Robert. Open Postman, proceed, use token, clicking on send. If you see here, we got 403 forbidden response. Now I am going to the user page, clicking on add membership and adding this group, clicking on select button. The group is added to the user. Now I am going to Postman, get new access token, choosing the user, open Postman, proceed, use token. Now the user have the required group, so we should get the proper response, clicking on send button, and if you see, we got the response. And how this entire setup is working. So if I go to the program.cs class, here we have defined our policy, and we have mentioned that we have a group authorization requirement, and inside this we can have any logic. So here we are using group ID logic, and if you want to use a different logic, you can do that as well. When the application is executing the request, it will look for the authorization handler which implemented this particular requirement. So here we have registered our group authorization handler. If you go to group authorization handler, and if you see, this group authorization handler implemented authorization handler with group authorization requirement, and we have used the same group authorization requirement inside our policy definition, and here we have added. So it will look for a authorization handler which has this template type, so that is this one. So I'm putting a breakpoint over here, so that how when we click on the send button, it will reach to this class. And here I'm expanding this context user, and after that claims results view. And here if you see, here we have the group claim and also the group ID. So this logic will be executed, and if the user has this type as groups and value as the group ID that we have passed, we are setting that the authorization is succeeded. So that's how this entire setup is working. But this is not the end of the story. There is one another corner case scenario that we are missing over here, and for that we must need to use the Graph API. Here I have another user, Jessica, and this user has so many number of groups and also the required group. So now I'm going to Postman, and here I'm clicking on get new access token, and here I'm choosing Jessica, open Postman, and after that clicking on proceed, use token, and now I'm clicking on send button. This user do have the required group, so now I'm clicking on continue. If you see here, we got 403 forbidden, but if you see, the user has this group. So what is happening here? Let us decode the token that we got from Azure. So I'm clicking over here. I'm copying this. I am in jwt.io. So here I'm pasting the token, and if you see, now it does not have any group related information, but it has the flag has groups, that is true. So this is called as overage. Like if you have too many number of groups, it will bloat the access token. There is certain limit on the HTTP header size. So if you generate the token with so many number of groups, it will be heavy and it will go beyond the HTTP header size limit. So in the real time, a user can have many number of groups. Now we have to write code to access Azure Graph API and check for the user group. So here I'm writing private read-only graph service client, press control dot and use this namespace, and after that underscore graph service client, selecting this, pressing control dot and generating the constructor. Here we have to check if the user is authenticated or not. So here I'm writing context dot user dot identity dot is authenticated is equal to true. Then only I want to go into this if block and execute the code. And here we have to check if context dot user dot claims dot any x x dot type is equal to has groups. This we have seen in that JWT decoded token. And here x dot value is equal to true. So that means groups overage. Here we have to call the Azure Graph API. So here I'm writing where groups result is equal to underscore graph service client dot me dot check member groups, and to this we have to pass a list of group IDs. So here I'm writing new list of string, and here we have to pass requirement dot group ID, and after that here we have to write request dot post async, and after that here we have to get the result. Now here I am checking if groups result dot any x x is equal to requirement dot group id. So if that group is present, then only we can say that this requirement is passed. What we are doing here we are using graph service client, and here me means the user who is accessing this application, and after that here we are checking for the groups. This will give us the list of groups. Those are assigned to the user based on the requirements that we have passed over here. Here it should be small g because inside the JWT token we have small g, and after that here in program.cs we have to add this as a transient because here we are accessing the graph service client as a dependency and it will not work if we make that as a singleton. I am saving this. This code is looking good to me, but it still have one issue. Let us see that after running the solution. Here I'm in the Postman tool. Here we have to pass one more scope, that is user.read, as we are accessing the Graph API. I'm clicking on Get New Access Token. I'm choosing Jessica, open Postman. Proceed, use token, clicking on Send button. Here the user is authenticated, and here we are checking for the overage condition, so this would be false and this will be true. And here we are accessing the Graph API and this will fail. So let us see the exception. So here it says the user or administrator has not consented to use the application ID named this one. So what it is saying is the user that we are trying to use to access the API, that is Jessica, has not consented this application to use the Graph API. So to avoid this issue, either we can take the consent from the user, that is Jessica, otherwise we can take the admin consent. Let us take the admin consent. So here I am in the API's app registration, that is Azure AD Auth with AD Groups app, and I'm going to API permissions, add permission, and I'm choosing Microsoft Graph. I'm choosing delegated permissions, and after that here I'm searching for user.read, selecting this, add permissions, and after that here I'm clicking on grant admin consent for default directory. This button is enabled as I logged in as the admin. If you log in as a user, this button will be disabled. So here I'm clicking on this button, clicking on yes. Now here I'm in the Postman tool, get new access token, signing in as Jessica, open Postman, proceed, use token, clicking on send button. Now we got the response. Now a question, do we have to write this authorize attribute on all the controllers? Not at all required. You can create a base controller and inherit your controllers from that base controller and decorate the base controller with this attribute. We can do this globally as well. In the program.cs or the startup.cs, you can add an authorization filter and give this policy name to that. It takes a lot of time and energy to make these kind of tutorials. If this video is helpful to you, please like this video, subscribe to Azure Teach.net channel as a token of appreciation. Thank you.